professor of Islamic law and Sharia at UCLA School of Law.
Thank you. You've talked in the past about, in an article about dog hostile traditions, in an article, Dogs in Islamic Tradition and Nature. Are these traditions part of the Quran? Is there an interpretation?
A lot of people assume that many of the laws of Islamic law come from the Quran, and that's not a fair assumption. No, the Quran doesn't have hostile traditions to dogs. The hostile traditions come from traditions that were attributed to the Prophet Muhammad as part of what is called the Sunnah, his oral tradition. And unlike the Quran, the traditions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad are not divine, they're not revelation. The Muslims don't consider them as revelation. And there is always a huge debate about what's authentic and what's not authentic, what's properly attributed to him and what's not properly attributed to him. In fact, the only parts of the Quran that does talk about dogs, it actually talks about them very positively, unlike some of the oral traditions attributed to the Prophet. So in one of the Quran's narratives, for example, the story of the people of the cave, which also exists in the biblical tradition, where a group of pious individuals go to sleep for 100 years in a cave and then are awakened by God and so on. In the Quranic narrative, it points out that while they slept in the cave, they were guarded and protected by a dog. And it's a long thing, but basically the way that the Quran talks about dogs is actually quite positive. They're related in the narrative always as friends of human beings. The hostile traditions are these oral transmissions attributed to the Prophet, and they fall in two categories. One category that focuses on the saliva of dogs, saying something to the effect that the saliva of dogs are not pure. And so that's one genre. The second genre draws a parallel between black dogs in particular and the demonic, or devils, demons. Now, on the other hand, at the same time that you have these traditions, you have other traditions attributed to the Prophet that are actually quite pro-dog. So one tradition, for instance, says that the Prophet used to pray with a puppy playing around him. Another tradition says that a man who saved the life of a dying dog was forgiven all his sins because he saved a dying dog and went to heaven. Another tradition says a woman who starved a cat to death was doomed to hell because she killed a cat, tortured a cat by starving the cat. God decreed that all her deeds were nullity and that she must go to hell. there was one of the companions of the Prophet known as Abu Huraira, means the father of the cat, because he would always go around at the time of the Prophet with a cat on his shoulder. And he was a big cat lover. He was known to be a big cat lover. And so on. I mean, there are the Islamic. We should always try to avoid the reductionism of saying, well, if it's in Islam, it must come from the Qur'an. Because, for instance, a lot of people don't know that there's a whole genre of literature in Islam that celebrates the characteristics, the personality characteristics of dogs. One very famous book that was written in early Islam and had a huge influence, and it's been translated to English actually. It's a book called The Superiority of Dogs Over Human Beings. And the author of this book was a very well-known jurist and set out to prove why dogs are superior in moral instinct to human beings, and how much Muslims can learn from studying the ethics of dogs, and so on and so forth.
You were taught dogs were impure and black dogs were evil. Is that true?
I was taught older tradition,
Mm-hmm.
part of that tradition, and you have to differentiate between the way a scholar is taught, the jurist, because the jurist is taught everything. Normal Muslim laity grow up with certain cultural biases that could be anchored in part of the tradition, the Islamic tradition, or could just simply be just a part of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
So, growing up in the Middle East, there is definitely a cultural orientation that I was very aware of and learned very early on, that considers dogs to be impure, their saliva particularly. And in fact, according to that school of thought, which usually correlates with the Wahhabi school of thought, the Saudi Wahhabi school of thought, is that you should not own dogs unless for hunting or for guard as protection, hunting, protection, or farming. Otherwise, you do not have an excuse to own a dog. Now, you won't find anything in the Islamic tradition, no reports, no narratives that tells you to treat dogs cruelly. That doesn't exist. And you're taught from early on that even if you can't own dogs, you have to treat them with mercy and that it's a sin to hurt any animal, not just dogs, but including dogs. Nevertheless, culturally, and I'm not talking about theology now, I've seen a lot of neglect towards street animals in Muslim countries. Children are often not sufficiently sensitized that these animals must be taken care of, and so it's not unusual to go to a neighborhood and find children chasing the dog or pelting dogs with little stones or something like that. In a country like Egypt, the streets are full with street dogs and cats as well. And it's quite unfortunate because the religion itself, regardless of whether you can own them or not, that's a separate issue, it emphasizes kindness and mercy towards animals so heavily that regardless of your good deeds as a pious Muslim, if you torment an animal, that is sufficient to damn your soul. And these are not controversial points. This is something that you learn in all seminaries, in all schools of theology. Uh, so it's a little bit of a disconnect and, to see cruelty towards animals when the theology, at least, makes it very clear that you could either damn your soul by hurting an animal or save your soul by being kind to an animal. So yeah.
In Islam, mistreating an animal is considered a sin. Assuming that many of those involved in the dog meat trade in Indonesia are Muslims, how do you think in their mind they reconcile this behavior?
Okay, let me be very, yes, in Islam, mistreatment of an animal, any animal, especially making an animal suffer, is as big of a sin that as you can commit. It, it is up there with fornication, adultery, consumption of alcohol. Some jurists have even said that it's up there with murder. It's a minority view, but nevertheless a respectable view in the Maliki school and Hanafi school. So that's number one. Number two, there is no disagreement among Islamic scholars and Islamic jurists and all the legal schools of Islam that consumption of what they call it zunab, meaning animals that have fangs, a fang, carnivores, are absolutely, you cannot consume them. It is absolutely prohibited. And the prohibition is as strict as consumption of pork. So to tell me that there's a Muslim that actually eats an animal or a cat or a lion or a tiger or a wolf or a coyote, anything that has is a carnivore, it's as astounding as saying a Muslim that thinks it's okay to eat pork. So consumption, a Muslim cannot consume a dog without incurring a very serious sin. And I am amazed at the religious illiteracy that would allow a Muslim to think that they can consume the meat of the dog. In Islamic theology, we are taught, and when I say we are taught, I'm talking about going through the what we would call the equivalent of seminary system and being trained as a jurist and so on, that you don't consume the flesh of a human being, you don't consume pork, and you absolutely, with the same level of prohibition, do not consume mammals who are carnivores. Now, there's a lot of things that go along with this. So, for instance, carnivores are given a level of intelligence and a level in their nervous system are developed enough where they are supposed to, studying their behaviors, are supposed to be indicate or avenues and paths towards understanding the beauty of the divine. Now, when you kill such an animal and consume it, you are severing a path to the majesty of the divine and the beauty of the divine. These animals were put on earth so that the theology teaches, so that we fulfill our obligation to take care of these animals. And in fact, the Qur'an describes the destruction of animals like that, flying animals, carnivores, animals that God said you cannot eat, as corrupting the earth, fasad fil ard. So, and that's one of the biggest sins you can commit. Now, So this is not even a debatable issue. I'm not aware of a single jurist that says it's okay to eat the flesh of dogs or cats. So this trade is astounding. The other thing that people should know, the very first uh, uh, charitable trust to be created for the caretake of street cats and dogs was created in the medieval era in the 12th century AD in Cairo by a pious Muslim woman. And until colonialism, there was a tradition of building these animal hostels, hotels basically, that where you house dogs and cats. Interesting story, when colonialism, Dutch colonialism, British colonialism, French colonialism came into occupied Muslim countries, they realized that the jurists advising these charitable trusts prohibited the killing of these animals. So you couldn't reduce their numbers by killing them. You can only fix them so that they don't reproduce, but you could not kill them. And the idea was so inconceivable and so ridiculous for the colonial powers that they released the animals from the charitable homes that they were in into the streets, and administration belonged to them as you know. So, and that started the deconstruction of the tradition of having charitable trusts taking care of animals by housing them. Because, I mean, there's a very famous incident by one of Napoleon's advisors upon invading Egypt, who thought that Egyptians, that's why Egyptians are backwards, is because they spend their money on taking care and housing these animals and feeding them. Well, you know, that's not what you do with animals. So historically, Muslims who forget their own history, their proud history about whether you can keep a dog in your home or not, but the history of that you please God by taking care of animals, taking care of dogs and cats in particular. The tradition, there is a very of the dog in particular, and I'll try to explain this as succinctly as I can. Dogs in particular in Muslim lore, and you could even say in Arab lore, Middle Eastern lore, were often cast in two nearly paradoxical narratives. In one narrative, they're the friend of the traveler, they're the friend of the sheep herder. The Prophet himself was a herder at one point, like nearly all the prophets were. And dogs were an essential companion. You can't travel in the desert without a dog. It's suicide. The camel and dog. You can't herd without a dog. The dog in Arabic poetry always plays the role of the friend, the loyal friend who's willing to sacrifice the dog's life or his own life to save their friend. But next to this, there was a tradition in the Near East that was always afraid of black dogs, because a mythology that black dogs and the night and things that dwell in the night, the demons, are somehow, for travelers, the appearance of a pack of dogs that are not loyal to any particular human owner, but roving dogs, was always a bad omen, because they were dangerous. They would often hunt in packs. Especially, there was an enormous problem with dogs that became rabid. And rabid dogs, it's not like today where we can actually, immunize dogs and so on. Rabid dogs terrified the pre-modern traveler and the village dwellers and so on. So there was that resulted in a certain lore of dread and fear about dogs. So on the one hand, you have this lore about dogs as the man's companion and friend, and always talking about dogs in very positive terms. But on the other hand, there was that cultural dread about dogs as a source of dread and fear, especially if they become rabid and they become ill. Now, add to this, in the Near East, there was a rather curious political practice. It started out by the Romans, that when the Romans would crucify their enemies, they would often crucify a dog with the human beings, put a dog up there, pin a dog up with them. And it was a way of belittling and humiliating their enemies. That practice was prohibited in Islamic law, but it continued to exist after the death of the Prophet. The Prophet banned it, but it continued to exist after the death of the Prophet for about 100 years, before it was completely stopped. So what I'm saying is that for a scholar who studies a tradition, you can understand where the anti-dog traditions come from. The cultural sense of fear, the dynamics, historical contingencies that resulted in people being scared of dogs, or thinking that they symbolically could be a source of danger. But at the same time, you also understand the traditions that talk about dogs as loyal friends and as saviors and protectors and so on. The, the, and I'm not the first scholar who did this, but the scholars before me who studied this entire picture, like a lot of Maliki scholars, a lot of Hanafi scholars, a lot of Indonesians would either be Hanafi or Maliki, some would be Shafi'i, but many Hanafi and Maliki scholars reached the conclusion that even the traditions that say the saliva of dogs are impure, are not authentic and not reliable. And as a result, they said as long as you keep your dog healthy, you make sure that your dog doesn't become rabid, and as long as you control what the dog consumes, so the dog is not eating poop, is not eating mice and rats and rodents and so on. In other words, you control what your dog eats, then a dog in fact can live in your home and their saliva is not a source of any impurity. So I actually rely on that opinion in my own life. That's why I'll pray. When I'm praying, I'll have dogs around me and I'm not worried about their saliva because I control their consumption. Now, this is on the issue of ownership. So maybe we can say we have three issues. The issue is, one, can you own dogs? Second, how do you treat dogs? And third is consuming dogs. Consuming dogs is the easiest. Absolutely prohibited. No ifs, ands, or buts. No exceptions. It is one of the gravest sins that you can commit. Second, the treatment of dogs. Any Muslim who bothers to learn their tradition will immediately run into numerous theological treatises that says if you mistreat an animal, if you torment an animal, you are offending against God directly, because that animal was created by God, put on earth by God, and again, so there unfortunately it's violated all the time, but there's no ifs, ands, and buts. The one where we have some discussion is whether how do you negotiate the issue of the debate about the dog's saliva, whether in fact it's always impure or only impure if you do not control what a dog consumes. And on that issue, I side with the school that says no, it's not always impure, and that whether it's pure or not depends on what the dog consumes. But this has nothing to do with, just because you think the dog's saliva is impure doesn't mean you can mistreat the dog. And it doesn't mean absolutely you can't consume the dog. Similar thing, by the way, as a Muslim, if I see a pig, God doesn't give me a license to mistreat a pig just because Muslims don't consume pork and Jews don't consume pork. I would still have to treat a pig with mercy and kindness because it's a creature that God created. If God didn't want to create pigs, God wouldn't have created pigs. One of the persistent cultural problems is that many Muslims continue to think of dogs as impure animals, and as a result, never develop a relation with these beautiful, amazing creatures, and in fact, are in fear of them. I often meet Muslims who are just anxious, very anxious about dogs because they've never interacted with them, and this contrasts very sharply with some of the precedents from the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. I mean, for instance, one of the very famous stories is a dog at the time of the Prophet who strolled into a mosque, the Prophet's mosque, and urinated in the Prophet's mosque. And the Prophet said, oh, bring some water and just pour it over the urine. Don't chase the dog away. Don't bother it. Don't interrupt it as it was urinating. The companions of the Prophet didn't even yell at the dog. So leave alone, do something uglier, like try to pelt the dog or something like that. That stories, people who want to learn, Muslims who want to learn their own tradition, will readily encounter evidence that dogs in the Islamic tradition were actually considered creatures that symbolized the brilliance and the singularity and the beauty of God's creation. For God to create these animals who are instinctively loyal to human beings and readily serve the interests of human beings and can form companionships with human beings. So, for instance, a scholar, his name was Ibn Murzaban, most Muslims in the modern age has forgotten who the scholar is, but he wrote a book that's in Arabic. It was translated to English, titled The Superiority of Dogs Over Many of Those Who Wear Clothes, i.e. human beings. And this is just an example of some smart scholar decided to translate this text to English years ago. Texts like this in the Islamic tradition are many, and they're, unfortunately, in the modern age, they're not published. They still remain in manuscript form, leave alone translated. My critical and essential point here is that, and I'm going to state it to Muslims in the most direct and practical way. If you want to learn about how wondrous the creation of God is, of Allah is, and if you want to gain favor with God, develop relationships of mercy and compassion with dogs. I mean, and cats, and animals in general, but dogs in particular are. As a Muslim scholar now, I have owned dogs for about 30 years, and I every night I sit and watch my dogs and keep saying Subhanallah. Subhanallah means praise be to God, because the way they interact, the way their sense of smell, their sense of hearing, their sense of loyalty, their sense of love, the way that every time I am out, they become anxious and stop eating and stop playing, and then the minute I even enter the neighborhood, leave alone just come close to the house. They immediately know that I am in the neighborhood and get very excited. Their sensitivity and their ability to interact, and then you think, from my perspective, no, evolution didn't create these animals with this highly advanced nervous system and amazingly nuanced personality types, and um, God did. God created these creatures to educate human beings as to what friendship means, what loyalty means, what sensitivity means. Leave alone sacrifice, because a dog will easily sacrifice themselves for your life. Most Muslims, get hung up over this issue of, well, are they clean? Are they pure? Let me be very clear again, juristically. No jurist says, unless the only exception are the Wahhabi jurists from Saudi Arabia who consider dogs just impure, their body is impure. There's no evidence for that. If you study the Islamic tradition, the only debate in scholarly circles, and here I mean scholars over centuries of Islam, is the saliva of dogs. Not their bodies, not their sweat, but their saliva. Obviously, all urine, whether human urine, animal urine, all urine is considered impure. But the Prophet showed us what you do if an animal urinates. You clean it, and you're done. You just clean it, like you clean the urine of a baby. In fact, you teach a dog not to urinate at home, and people, if they invest the time, they'll learn that dogs become remarkably sensitive to the fact that they don't want to soil the place they live in, and to keep it very clean, sometimes even cleaner than human beings. So the only issue is the saliva of dogs. And again, to be very clear, Maliki and Hanafi scholars, after studying all the traditions, all the reports that talk about saliva of dogs, came to the logical and natural position that the saliva of dogs is an issue only because it's an issue only if we do not control what dogs consume. But if you control what dogs consume, in other words, you give dogs dog food and you make sure that you teach a dog only to eat what you give it, then there's no issue with the saliva of dogs. When you read, one of the very famous traditions of the time of the Prophet is that there was a dog in the desert. The dog was extremely thirsty and panting from thirst. A man who knew the Prophet Muhammad saw the dog, went down a well. The well had low water levels, so he climbed down the well, he put the water in a container, climbed up, and gave the thirsty dog water. And when the Prophet heard of the story, he said, "Today you have reserved a place in heaven." Now, Muslims, think of that. If your Prophet tells you that by a man providing a thirsty dog with water, that was his ticket to heaven, think of how many favors you can earn with God if you are kind and gentle and loving towards animals, because they're not there by happenstance. Allah says in the Qur'an that no creature on the face of God's earth is there by accident. That God creates every creature knowing where it begins and where it ends. So, and further, the Quran says that God has created all things and entrusted you, human beings, with it. And that failing to carry the trust of God vis-a-vis God's creation is a corruption of earth, fasad fil ard, as the Quran calls it. So, in fact, you must treat a dog with a view, or you must treat all animals, but I'm specifically talking about dogs in this situation, with a view towards the fact that God is watching you, and God treats you as an agent who must discharge a trust, and the trust is a trust of kindness and caretaking and compassion. And if you fail in doing so, you're going to eventually answer to God. It's just after, if you're a Muslim, you believe in the hereafter. And if you believe in the hereafter, you believe you will account for your sins. And lack of kindness to dogs, cruelty to dogs, is a sin you will answer to. As a believing Muslim, there's no if, ands, or buts about it. It's extremely clear to me. I can, people in Indonesia and elsewhere, in Malaysia, and they are very well aware. I mean, they know my books that have been translated and know my lectures, and I visited there several times. And I'll tell you that every night, by being kind to my dogs, I earn favor with Allah. I, every time I see a dog healthy and happy, with random acts of kindness, I feel that I have come closer to Allah and earned Allah's favor. And I do so as a theologian and as a faqih, as a jurist. I don't do so despite the Islamic tradition. I do it because of the Islamic tradition. And some people have a phobia towards dogs. If you get to know dogs, you'll find that this phobia is overcome. Dogs are not just remarkably gentle and smart and intelligent and loyal, but even dogs that are vicious, in most of the time, the vast majority of the time, they become vicious because of the mistreatment by human beings. So, dogs, every time you encounter an animal, I mean, this is our religion. Every time you encounter an animal, the Prophet said this about a man who had put too much of a load on a donkey and was trying to get the donkey to walk, and the donkey stalled because the load was too heavy. And the Prophet came to him and said, "This donkey will testify against you in the hereafter." So every time you encounter an animal and you mistreat it, remember that this animal, this cat, this dog, this whatever animals, will testify against you in the hereafter and will hold you accountable in the hereafter. This should be enough for a conscientious believing Muslim to say, this is an opportunity for me to make up for my sins. This is an opportunity for me to carry favor with Allah. This is an opportunity for me to do good deeds. And as the Qur'an said to the Prophet, that we have only sent you as a mercy to humankind. This is an opportunity to fulfill the message of the Prophet, of mercy to creation. And the Quran actually literally says mercy to creation, to all creation. And so it to me, it is just fundamentally, I'll use the word, blasphemous, to see a Muslim think that it is okay to mistreat a dog. There was a Wahhabi jurist years ago, unfortunately, who issued some guy told him, "I have a dog, I own a dog, and I read your fatwa, this guy was in Saudi Arabia, that says it's haram, it's unlawful to own dogs. And so I took the dog out to the desert and abandoned it there, but then the dog found its way home. So I took the dog out again and put him further away, and then the dog found its way home. And then a third time. So that jurist who, what do I say, extremely cruel and un-Islamic, this Wahhabi jurist, says, well, what you should do is take the dog to another city altogether and basically abandon it in the wilderness and so it can't find its way home. You know, in other words, the fact that the dog managed to find you 3 times doesn't somehow make it allowable for you to. And I read this fatwa and I'm thinking to myself, this Wahhabi jurist has no fear of God. I mean, doesn't he think that if God creates an animal that can figure out its way home 3 times, God creates this highly evolved nervous system and system of consciousness. Doesn't it occur to this jurist that there is a purpose to this animal other than being abandoned and left to die? Moreover, what authority does this Wahhabi jurist have to say you cannot keep a dog at your home? There is a tradition that says angels will not enter a dwelling that has dogs, attributed to the Prophet. But scholars have studied these traditions and have concluded centuries ago that it's a fabrication, that it's not authentic. The only jurists or only people who still cite to this tradition as authentic are Wahhabi scholars. It's extremely unfortunate because it's someone who fabricated, invented a lie and attributed it to our Prophet. And it's due time that Muslims realize that our Prophet would never say something like that. If we don't have a tradition that says angels don't enter a place where pigs are, why would they not enter a place where dogs are? What is it about dogs that would make angels, who are, after all, God's creatures, not enter a dwelling? It's an absurdity. And I mean, and other than the fact that its chain of transmission is a mess, it has in its chain of transmission several liars, has many other problems, individuals that we can't even track, we don't know their identity. So I don't know how to put it stronger than this. It's an absolute obligation to treat dogs with kindness. It's an absolute blessing and grace from Allah to get to know the dogs and their wondrous, majestic, divine personalities. And it's an absolute sin to mistreat dogs, torment dogs, because they suffer depression just like human beings, and when or to leave alone consume them, which is just mind-boggling.